how did the Ottomans rule? The Ottoman command structure consisted of the devshirme conscripting and educating people in Istanbul. They were then sent as governors to various sanjaks, aka provinces, to represent the Ottoman crown. These now appointed governors would work with translators and had the job of overseeing provincial military order and to collect tax revenue. These governors were educated in Ottoman Turkish, hence the least bothered to learn Arabic. A mixture of Arabic and Turkish was used for communication and order. For administrative rules, especially Bosniaks and Albanians played a crucial role. For upholding the law, a chief Hanafi judge was appointed as overseer of criminal and commercial cases, as well as private matters and complaints about the abuse of power of the governor. The Hanafi chief was usually appointed from Istanbul, but there were also locals being appointed to this position. The chief judge could be of any ethnic origin as well. In Arab lands, they would graduate from state-sponsored madrasas, which produced a Turkish-speaking elite within Arab lands. The chief legal theorist, however, was always a local mufti scholar. Arab scholars perceived themselves as intellectuals and moral equals to the appointed man by the Sultan. They were usually held in higher regards than the governor by the locals, since the mufti scholar natively spoke Arabic and were more connected to the people. In essence, there were two legislatives, one appointed by the Ottoman crown, the other elected by the Arab ulama. Since the governor had more power, the Ottoman legislative was accepted as the higher instance. That being said, the provincial military force consisted of janissaries, irregular troops, and mercenaries, so local protection was predominantly done by local forces. The lack of numbers of Turkish-speaking people also ensured the lack of rebellions by rogue governors, so low Turkish-speaking numbers were intended. The Muslim military units from Anatolia were given timars in Arab lands. They were to oversee land and contribute to the manpower by themselves. Basically, timars were villages and it was expected that sipahi, cavalrymen, would live on them. So in case of a war, they would gather and contribute to the Ottoman army. The effectiveness of the system is unclear. As an example, in 1655, 26 out of the 130 sipahis in Aleppo presented themselves for the campaign in Crete. The given land would be used to grow various fruits and vegetables or nuts, and even though the trees themselves could be sold and inherited by the individual quote-unquote lord, the land was always state-owned. Either way, ayans were another essential part of Ottoman rule. Ayans were local elites that cooperated or compromised power with the governor. It's unclear how ayan was defined and what it entitled, but they existed until the last days of the Ottomans and essentially became nobility without political power. They were, however, sometimes used to establish a quasi-independent province within the Ottoman Empire. As an example and quote from the book, in the Syrian province, Cesar Ahmed Pasha from Acre gained governorship of Sidon and occasionally Damascus between 1775 and 1803, created a power base and private army, resembling his contemporaries in Anatolia. Generally speaking, the further the governor was, the more power and control the governor could muster and act independently. This is especially true for the Maghreb governors, who sometimes entirely ignored commands from the imperial palace. But the different governors acted as a check and balance for each other. So if one governor rebelled, the surrounding governors could jump on the rebelling governor, gaining benefits from the imperial palace. The independence of the governor went to great lengths, which is worth noting. Sukeli Ali in Algiers, Aliolu Hussein in Tunis, and Karaman Ahmed in Tripoli all seized control of governorship of the respective cities in the early part of the 18th century and established hereditary dynasties with their descendants succeeding as governors well into the 19th century. These governors were of Islamic Anatolian or Cretan origin with armed retainers who were called janissaries that were recruited from Anatolia or Mediterranean islands. These governors were ethnically and culturally Turkish, but not necessarily Ottoman. They acted on their own with a heavy focus on piracy, which was the lifeblood of the region. There were also local lords that were used. Among the lands of the Druze and the Kurds of southeast Anatolia, these local lords would replace the governor or the chief judge entirely, even though they would formally and legally be under the governor. Effectively, the regions would be governed de facto independently by the locals. They still paid taxes and provided units if necessary, but other than that, the Ottomans just ignored them since direct control wasn't worth the blood. Finally, guilds are also worth mentioning. They were ethnic-centered collectives, not by design, but by nepotism among the locals. As a result, in Aleppo, Kurds were generally porters. In southeastern Anatolia, Armenians were specialized in a specific type of bread. Most goldsmiths throughout the region were Jews, and in Aleppo, in particular, they were Christians. These guilds were left unchecked to their own unless they interfered or cut on government revenue, in which case taxes were imposed. So for now, the state structure, the loyalty of the Arabs, and the economic, political, ideological, as well as the legislative state of the Ottoman Empire with respect to Ottoman lands was explained. Arab cities are, by the end of the 16th century, among the largest cities in the world. Cairo with around 200,000 people, Aleppo with around 100,000 people, Damascus and Baghdad with around 90,000 people, Tunis with around 80,000 people, Mosul with around 55,000 people. To summarize the most important point, Arabs would cooperate, legitimize, and finance the Ottoman state in return for protection, safety, and economic prosperity and justice. This is the social contract the Ottomans underwent with the Arab society, at least until the Reformation period in the 19th century. The economic prosperity that came with the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman sphere of influence continued throughout the 16th and partially 17th century. There's obviously much more to the topic, especially with regards to Waqfs and Miri, which is a topic of its own, but it would be too much to extensively cover, which is why I want to briefly mention some events in the 16th to 18th century, namely the global inflation that was caused by the theft of gold and silver from the New World to the Old World by the Spanish Empire, which eventually resulted in inflation in the Middle East. This obviously affected the prosperity of Arab cities. This played a role in the late 16th to early 17th century. The conquest of the subcontinent by European powers. While previously the subcontinent was controlled by Muslim nations, mostly Muslim nations, that were very open and positive to the Ottoman Empire, trade between India and the Middle East was more and more controlled by European powers. This resulted in trade being redirected around Africa to Europe rather than through the Middle East to Europe, which played an increasing role from the 18th century onwards. The Little Ice Age is worth mentioning, which resulted in various periods of drought and climate change. At certain times, farmers had to leave their fields in certain areas due to the effects of climate change. Sometimes this resulted in certain areas being entirely abandoned, which the Ottomans tried to resettle with problematic Turkmens, specifically İlbekli and Bekrili Turkmen, granting a 32-year tax-free residence, but instead of becoming farmers, the Turkmens just started raiding again. There were similar problems with Kurds and Arabs, but you get the idea of social disorder and revolt due to climate change. Furthermore, climate change also resulted in heavy urbanization in Arab lands throughout the 17th and 18th century, which further fueled abandoned villages and lands. Lastly, it's also important to note that while most of the Ottoman Empire saw major and minor investments and prosperity, the region of modern-day Iraq was essentially ignored by the Ottoman crown for the simple reason that it was a frontier region. It's also worth noting that almost all governors of Baghdad between 1747 and 1831 were originally Mamluks. The Ottoman government didn't see getting central authority over it worth the trouble as long as they paid taxes and defended Iraq. There was obviously much more to the entire topic. Sometimes there was war in the east, sometimes there was diseases and illnesses due to urbanization, sometimes there were economic recessions, sometimes there were rebellions. You get the idea. But essentially what I said covered the first 1 to 3 centuries of the Ottoman Empire. Things get interesting with the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon. When France invaded Egypt, they couldn't finish off the Mamluk emirs. Napoleon, not intending to reveal his intentions, proclaimed to the Egyptians in badly written Arabic that he only wants to rid the country of the treacherous Mamluks and to restore Egypt to its rightful liege, Lord Sultan Selim III. Plot twist, no one bought it. With the help of the British Navy, Napoleon was eventually defeated. In hindsight, the Ottoman units did a decent job considering the brilliance of Napoleon, the modern equipment of the French troops, and the lack of Ottoman units present in Egypt and Levant, regardless of the help by the British Navy. But it still came at a shock. As previously mentioned, the social contract the Ottomans underwent with the Arab world was that of protection and safety, which was broken. The Ottomans failed to see and react to the French invasion in time, and it wasn't done without external Christian help. This did not result in Arabs abandoning the Ottoman crown, but this did cause the first cracks and concerns in Arab society. If this was the only concern and the only quote-unquote failure, it wouldn't be a big deal, but two things happened afterwards. First, Muhammad Ali purged his rivals and took full control over Egypt. He started a Western reform process which was welcomed by many Arabs. Even though Muhammad Ali is hailed as the birth of the modern Egypt nation, Egypt became more Turkish than ever. Ottoman Turkish became court and administrative language. Leading bureaucrats and military officers spoke Turkish, and the Arabic natives collectively called the ruling government under Muhammad Ali Turks. The important part, however, is that he became an alternative to Ottoman rule, but was another crack in Ottoman-Arab relations. This in itself was not a problem at first, since at the beginning Muhammad Ali was seen as the loyal governor that worked in the name of the imperial palace, but a second important event occurred: the Wahhabi invasion. In the early 19th century, Wahhabi raiders looted trade routes and pilgrims. The Ottoman Empire was simply unable to do anything about it for the simple reason that the governors were responsible for the security of the trade and pilgrim routes. But there was no punishment or reward for the governors to tackle the problem, so nothing was done by them. This became another crack in Ottoman-Arab relations. In desperation, Sultan Mahmud II asked Mehmed Ali, aka Muhammad Ali, for help, who solved the problem in the early 19th century, further elevating him as an alternative in the eyes of many Arabs. It also started a scholarly discussion about Ottoman Islam and its rejection. Now we know for a fact that Egyptian-Ottoman relations broke down at one point, which is an entire topic of its own, pinpointed at various reasons, but long story short, the Greeks rebelled, the Ottomans promised Muhammad Ali land in return for defeating the Greeks, the international community got involved, and the Egyptian and Ottoman fleet were sent into oblivion. Afterwards, a couple of years later, Muhammad Ali rebelled, defeated the Ottomans, gained Syria, and was marching to full conquest. In desperation, the Ottomans asked for Russian help, which defeated the Egyptian army. A couple of years later, the Ottomans attempted to retake Syria, failed, got help by European powers, and regained the Levant and Hijaz, but lost Egypt for good. Again, this is a topic of its own, but the important part here is that the Ottomans showed that they could not act as protectors of the Muslim world anymore. Most Arabs were still loyal to the Ottoman Empire, since they were one of, if not the last Muslim bastion, but harsher tones became more and more vocal. A couple of decades down the line, anti-Ottoman Arabs from Egypt would even smuggle propaganda into Ottoman-controlled Arab lands protected by European powers. It's hard to say how popular the Ottomans were at that time among Arabs, but to give an example from a rebellion in 1850 in Aleppo, the locals wrote a common letter to the Sultan stating, "If our Lord Sultan should command it, we would willingly surrender our wealth, our lives, and our children as martyrs for our Lord, the Sultan, and the faith of Islam." Signed by the common people of Aleppo. It should be noted that the invasion of Muhammad Ali was not necessarily popular in the Levant. Muhammad Ali showed very little respect to the ulema and tried to break their power. Christians, in particular Catholics, were used and even given property of other Christian dominations in order to police the conquered cities. To make matters worse, the jizya was imposed on the Muslims. So the Damascus elite, as an example, was most certainly happy to see them gone in the 1840s. These conflicts, as well as rebellions, particularly on the Balkan, made it painfully obvious to the Ottoman government that reforms were necessary, which started the Tanzimat reform program in 1839.